Welcome to the Ernest Becker Foundation's webinar on gun violence. My name is Deborah Jacobs, and I'm the Executive Director for the Ernest Becker Foundation. We're glad you're here, and thank you especially for those who supported us with a donation. The Ernest Becker Foundation was founded in 1993 to continue the work and application of Ernest Becker. Specifically, we examine ways in which the human awareness of our own mortality affects our beliefs and behaviors on both an individual and societal level. We believe that understanding the function of death anxiety in our beings can provide tools for us to live more easily together as humans. Over the years, the EBF has sponsored events, supported research, hosted speakers, and developed content related to Becker's synthesis and related science. Our quarterly newsletters examine various social issues in light of our relationship to mortality. For example, our most recent one is on today's topic on death anxiety and gun violence. We are also a hub for interested people who come across this work and want to learn more and talk to others who have similar interests. Finally, if you find this webinar valuable, please support the EBF by signing up for our newsletters, telling your friends about us, and making a donation. For today's presentation, we will offer an introduction to the ideas of Ernest Becker and terror management, which is the scientific application of his ideas. We're going to apply these ideas to the subject of gun violence. Terror management theory, or TMT as we call it, was developed in the mid-1980s by 3 psychology professors, one of whom we're honored to have as a panelist today, Jeff Greenberg. This area of social science has demonstrated through thousands of studies the validity of Becker's synthesis, which we are today again applying to gun violence. Please keep in mind that if you're new to these ideas, that it's a lot to digest in an hour webinar, but we have many resources available on our website if you're intrigued and want to learn more. One of the reasons we put on these webinars is that so people who are actively engaged in trying to make our world a more peaceful place will have a background in Becker and terror management theory to use in their efforts. For this reason, I'm very grateful to be able to have as our moderator today, Julia Weber, who serves as implementation director for the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. I turn it over to Julia, knowing that she has firsthand experience trying to understand and reduce gun violence in our country and is a perfect person to lead this conversation. So welcome and thank you, Julia.
Well, thank you very much, Deborah, and welcome to our panelists and everyone tuning in today. I'm so pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to talk with you all about this important issue. I'm also deeply appreciative to the Ernest Becker Foundation for bringing us all together. And as Deborah mentioned, I work with Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, part of the national organization founded by former Congresswoman and gun violence survivor Gabby Giffords. My work there focuses on drafting laws, providing training, and advocating for fair and effective approaches to implementing gun violence prevention policies. Today's focus on gun violence is so important because when we understand more about gun violence, we can do an even better job preventing harm and intervening more effectively. To help begin the discussion, I want to describe a bit more about why this is such a critical conversation. In 2014, just 8 years ago, an average of 92 people per day died from gun violence in the United States. By 2017, this figure had risen to an average of 109 gun deaths per day. And in 2020, an average of nearly 124 people died from gun violence each day, a total of 45,222 people that year alone. Nearly every American can expect to know at least one person who will die as the result of gun violence, which is now the leading cause of death for children and adolescents in the United States. We know gun violence takes many different forms, and we know it often impacts people differently based on who we are and where we live. While a majority of gun deaths in the United States are suicide, more than a third are homicides. And gun homicides take multiple distinct forms, including community violence, domestic violence, police-involved shootings, mass shootings. Horrifically, Black men make up 52% of all gun homicide victims in the United States, despite comprising less than 6% of the population. We tend to hear a lot in the media about mass shootings, and we now know that 59% of mass shootings from 2014 to 2019 were related to domestic violence. And recently, the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center analyzed use of force incidents in New Jersey, finding that among incidents where a gun is brandished by police, Black and Latinx residents are more likely to be shot and shot numerous times compared to white residents. And not all shootings result in lethal outcomes, of course. There are over 1 million women alive today who have been shot or shot at by their intimate partner. Every day, people are threatened in their homes, families, communities. However, there's certainly reason to be hopeful, to believe that we can make a difference. Policies and procedures such as removing firearms when someone has become prohibited from owning them work. We see a 16% reduction in homicide in places that have those policies in place. And there are many other steps we can take in the face of this difficult reality, including having these kinds of conversations that we're having today. We need to act for so many reasons, including because of what we know from recent research in California. Relatively few people may experience or witness a violent act involving firearms, but a large majority of those surveyed in the state report having had an experience of violence, or an EV. These include hearing gunshots in the neighborhood, encountering a sidewalk memorial to a violent death, or learning about a violent event through their social network. Dr. Garen Wintemute, the lead researcher on that study, told us there were people who responded to their survey indicating they passed sidewalk memorials 25 times or more a week. Dr. Wintemute asked, at what point does living in your neighborhood resemble living in a cemetery? What does that do to your sense of a future for your community and yourself? So let's get into the discussion with our experts here today. And I'd like to start with our first panelist, Jeff Greenberg, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Thank you, Jeff, for kicking this off. And I would love to know a bit more about how you think the lens of death anxiety, terror management theory can help us understand the patterns of gun violence in this country.
Okay, sure. Thanks a lot for all the work you do, Julia. So what Becker and terror management theory and research suggest is that as humans, we're all burdened with this awareness of our mortality and our vulnerability to potential death. And that puts us in an anxiety-prone state by the nature of our intellect. And what we need to do to feel secure in the world is to feel like we're more than just animals fated to obliteration upon death. And the way we try to do that is by feeling like we're valuable contributors to a meaningful world. And so we have a sense of significance, that we matter in the world. It also suggests that, well, if we matter in the world, then we're going to matter even beyond our own physical death, through a mortal soul, through our accomplishments, through the impact we have on the world. So we're all trying to sustain that belief that we are that kind of being of value. And when you look at the kinds of gun violence that are prevalent in the United States, a lot of it has to do with people either trying to establish significance through gun violence, trying to protect their significance through gun violence, or people who simply do not have a sense of significance at all and are just lashing out with gun violence. So let me really quickly mention 4 kinds of gun violence that I think that this analysis provides some insight into. First, you have sort of urban violence, low SES communities where there's a lot of gun violence. Here you have people who oftentimes suffer with poverty. And, in the United States, money, wealth, possessions are a big part of how people feel that they have significance, that they matter, that they're important. And so for people who struggle to feel that in these communities, sometimes they'll turn to illegal enterprises, such as the drug trade. And once you get involved in illegal drug trade, you start making money, you can buy things, you can take people out on dates, all that stuff. But then you got to protect, right? You got to protect those resources, and that often contributes to violence. In addition, for members of marginalized communities, there's a sense that they're not valued in the larger community. And that probably contributes to kind of trying to seek a sense of significance in these, less mainstream, less constructive kinds of ways. Second kind of gun violence that we see, of course, is the mass shootings, which have increased dramatically ever since Columbine here in the US. And I think there's two kinds. One kind is people who have no sense of value, no sense of significance, have been humiliated, and are just lashing out randomly as a way to make a mark on the world. The other kind is hate crimes and ideology-based violence against particular groups who are viewed as evil. And so these ideologies help these people feel valuable. So a white supremacist feels valuable because he or she is white and feels like they have to protect those values and get rid of evil. Unfortunately, that evil will be other innocent people. And the last kind, just super briefly, is domestic violence. And so you have a lot of men, especially, who are heavily invested in a relationship, and when they feel it's threatened or they lose it, their whole sense of value is undermined, and they lash out with gun violence. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And certainly your description helps with putting these complex issues into context and provides a framework for a number of points I think we'll have a chance to talk about in the next little while together. So thank you. I'd like to now turn to you, Kirk Schneider, co-founder and president of the Existential Humanistic Institute, which is a psychotherapy training center. And Kurt is also a current candidate for president of the American Psychological Association, the APA. So Kirk, can an existential psychodynamic perspective help us understand what drives people to violence or gun violence, and what you refer to as the polarized mind?
Yes, very much so. And thank you, Julia. Well, I'll be echoing much of what Jeff just articulated, but perhaps more from a clinical, depth psychological point of view. So let's see what I can add to it. First of all, I do see the gun violence as an example of the polarized mind. And I define the polarized mind as the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. And I think that it leads to all kinds of extremist, destructive behavior throughout our history as human beings. Now, the big question for me is, and I think perhaps the biggest underlying issue is how primal this terror is that drives the polarized mind. Polarized mind tends to be based on fear. It's fear-driven. Our perception narrows. We become absolutistic. We become tyrannical as a way to defend against this fear. From a psychotherapeutic standpoint, what I see and what I think a lot of the data indicates is that this fear goes very, very deep. And I think Otto Rank, an underappreciated theorist, really hit the nail on the head with his notion that it begins at the point of birth, often, where we move from a state of relative non-existence and unity to sudden abrupt existence and disunity, pandemonium. And that kind of template for the human condition begins our sense of fear of otherness. That's where we learn about otherness and the threat of otherness. Because before we were not separated, right? So That's a rip sort of in the fabric of our being. And how that's handled by the caretakers and by the culture is all important. And so often, unfortunately, caretakers and culture come from a fear-based place as well. And so the threats are just amplified even more. And if people go through trauma, it gets amplified even more. This utter sense of groundlessness and helplessness. I think that's a way to really characterize this sense of insignificance that Jeff was talking about, and even death anxiety. And so I know I need to wrap up. There's so much here, but I think we see in examples of famous killers, destroyers. You just take Mao, Stalin, and Hitler. In their backgrounds, how utterly decimated they were as children and from very young ages, with a sense of helplessness and groundlessness, and how much they overcompensate through attempting to lord themselves over others and look powerful. And we see this in other killers, Muhammad Atta, 9/11, Jeffrey Dahmer, also seems to have this background and this dire need for extreme power and domination. And the Columbine folks, I just want to mention quickly, I think rejection is a through line here. The perception of being rejected, especially by people who feel such a raw connection with groundlessness and helplessness, that is a major trigger for this kind of overcompensation. Stop there.
Thank you, Kirk. You raised so many important points as well. And so often when we think about fear and gun violence, we're thinking about victims, which obviously is critically important, and the trauma associated with victimization as well as potential of becoming a victim. But it's, I think, also important to elevate how fear runs through those who may be committing the harm, perpetrating harm as well. And certainly in my work around domestic violence, people often want to identify red flags. What can we do? How can we know that somebody might commit heinous acts of mass violence? And we know now from the research that domestic violence is one of those indicators, and taking much more seriously, hopefully, the impact that violence at home and families can have on children, on the trauma that can occur as a result, and how that can contribute. And certainly we know the gun industry is taking advantage of this fear that runs through our society in terms of what we're seeing, which is an increase in women purchasing firearms, and ad campaigns just focusing on victims of domestic violence, that somehow you can defend yourself more effectively, even though we know that the presence of a gun increases the risk of lethality for victims of domestic violence significantly. So thank you for bringing up those points. And let's turn to you now, Pete. Pete Kurtz-Glovis is a graduate research assistant at the Pennsylvania State University School of Public Policy, who works with the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. And you've looked, Pete, into extremism and people who become radicalized. What parallels do you see with gun violence in the US, our country's relationship to guns overall, and white supremacy in your work?
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia, and Jeff and Kirk. Thank you guys as well for your insight here. Within the United States and both white supremacist circles, guns are historically viewed as an extension of masculinity, a way for a man to defend himself as well as his wife and family, and to defend his country. Kind of within that scope, the AR-15 specifically is really glorified in both of these circles for both practical and aesthetic reasons. And I will be focused mostly on the United States. I know there are other perceptions of guns throughout the world, but within the US, it accounts for 46% of the global stock of civilian-owned firearms. So that's kind of what the focus is there. One of the biggest traits kind of among perpetrators of mass violence and white supremacist ideology is an obsession with guns and the power that they kind of confer to not only themselves, but also the audience that their actions are for. And that's what these acts of violence are for, the audience that is going to then take it in afterwards. The AR-15 is their preferred weapon, in part because it's modeled after the M4, which is used by the US military. So this was most recently used in Buffalo, actually. And it sort of plays off of the aesthetics and the politics echoed in the Christchurch shooting years ago. And I think also when we're talking about the similarities here, there's an important question of who guns are for and what types of guns that they surround themselves with. The 9mm pistol and AR-15 or a pistol grip shotgun, all of these are marketed as personal or home defense weapons. But who are the owners defending themselves against? I think it's a very important question. And historically within the United States, both the military and US citizens were armed and encouraged to kill Native Americans and also to, apprehend runaway slaves and later on help enforce Jim Crow laws. So these questions of the similarities between US gun culture and the sort of history of the United States and white supremacy all kind of dovetail together pretty tightly and create a dangerous soup, I think, especially for folks that become radicalized, who, as Kirk and Jeff pointed out, are searching for a deeper sense of meaning, but are in ways poisoned almost, whereas instead of seeking a healthy outlet through their community, they end up acting out in a way that is inverted.
Thank you very much, Pete. And there's a lot to explore there, of course, unpack and make connections to various other aspects of US culture and how it relates to gun culture, of course. I'm curious at this point, and let me just make sure that the audience knows that we are going to have Q&A in just a bit, your opportunity to pose questions to our panelists. So please be thinking about that and beginning to ask your questions, and we'll turn to your questions in just a bit. But for everyone, for all the panelists, given your expertise, I'm curious if you would each speak a bit to what your personal feelings are when you wake up and hear about yet another shooting in the United States. And anyone, please feel free to start us off.
Yeah, I could start. I mean, we're all going to die, right? There's all sorts of potential causes. And it deeply saddens me that we humans, knowing that we're going to die, everybody we care about is going to die, actually facilitate that happening to our fellow humans. And, it makes us very different than any other species, the extent to which we kill members of our own species. So, yeah, it's very sad. And of course, the mass shootings get most of the media attention, and that's certainly understandable. But the day-to-day gun violence is even bigger problem.
Anyone else, Kirk, Pete, if reactions when you hear about yet another shooting? Yes.
I feel like many people very, very helpless, scared for my community, scared for my family, myself, for humanity. But I quickly go into my even more alarming concern with our culture at large. And I think that Pete did touch on this pretty directly, but it seems to me that it's another symptom of the severe decay of our society and many of the societies in the world that are based so much on the quick fix, instant result model of living, the efficiency model of living. I think this goes along with the hypermasculinization that we were talking about earlier. It's in many ways, it's overcompensatory itself for being able to be more present to our vulnerable sides, our slower sides, if you are more deliberative sides, because those bring up all kinds of ambiguities and challenges that a quick fix, instant result culture based in large part on the capitalist model that we're ruled under avoids. So my point being that this is rampant through so many levels of our culture and through the way we parent and the messages we give to kids about how you should instantly be superior, win as opposed to lose. You can turn things around immediately with the various techniques and technologies we have, guns being a major aspect of that. So that's a big sadness of mine, and something I think we really need to challenge very strongly and quickly.
Absolutely. Your remarks and both aspects of what Pete and Jeff, you both mentioned, also make me think about the sadness I have felt at learning that the JR-15 is now an item that's being marketed and designed for children, a scaled down version of the AR-15. And the marketing campaign includes cartoon images, and it's very child focused for both girls and boys, but the idea being to get children interested and comfortable, quote unquote, comfortable at an earlier age with the AR-15, and again, create an additional set of customers. But that fear, and when you talk about various approaches to parenting, I mean, it's all interrelated, and the different responses, become obvious in terms of who may be targeted or attracted by that kind of approach. So, Pete, any thoughts about this line of thinking in terms of waking up and hearing about yet another shooting somewhere in the U.S.?
Yeah. I typically, anytime it happens, I feel a bit of, I think it's exhaustion almost. I'm a bit younger, so I've kind of always lived in a world where mass shootings are happening. It's been kind of a part of my growing up, a part of my general life. I've been in rooms and streets where firearms were brandished and had to flee, and it has just been what it is. And that exhaustion, I think, is palpable. And I think that there's that, as well as a type of a motivation towards action. I want to do more to kind of alleviate some of that. And I think, as we've all talked, I think that firearm proliferation is a part of this. I also, but thinking beyond that and knowing that there are parts of the world where there are readily available firearms and people don't use them in the same way as folks in the United States do, I worry about what is the cultural influences that are driving people to commit absolutely horrible acts of mass violence, sometimes against children, often against people who are unarmed, often against people who have actually not harmed the shooter in any way. How do we combat that sort of cultural front? I don't know that there's necessarily, I don't think realistically there's a world where we actually outlaw firearms in the United States, at least not in the short term. But I do think that realistically there's a world where we can start to turn back some of those cultural influences. We can start to enforce common sense gun laws, red flag laws, those sorts of things. So that's sort of exhaustion, and then on my good days followed by motivation.
So again, lots to unpack, of course, and thank you for your comments. You think about the fact that there's over 393 million firearms estimated to be owned privately in the United States, which certainly it far exceeds any other country in the world. And so the availability makes a difference. But Pete, as you point out, there are firearms available, maybe not as many, but available to people elsewhere in the world, and they are not utilized in the same way. So there's more to unpack and understand about the cultural influences and the decisions that are made, or the actions that are taken in the United States in particular around all of that. And we have a question now. We're going to jump into some questions from the audience. I think anyone could possibly respond to this. Can you speak to gun fetishization and the fantasies of besiegement that seem to commonly underwrite such a fetish? Does that relate to these psychological concepts? So the ways that we fetishize firearms in this country, does that relate to these psychological concepts? Anyone want to, Jeff, I see you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to take that one to start?
Take the first shot. When you think about guns represent two very clear things. One is the threat of death. And generally speaking, liberal people who want better gun laws view guns mainly in that way, that they're contributing to violence and to death. The other way to look at guns is they give people a sense of power over life and death. And Becker was very strong on this, that the capacity to kill and the possibility of being able to kind of cause death gives people a sense of power and control that helps them cope with their own fears. And so I think there's quite a bit of that that goes on with the fetishization of guns. It's because they represent power and they represent control over life and death. And that's one way to try and handle one's own fears.
I think there's definitely a deep kind of fetishization there, and it's not lost either on folks who perpetrate mass shootings, either white supremacist or otherwise. I have two pull quotes here actually that I'd like to share to illustrate that point. Am I allowed to swear? I'm sorry, I didn't even ask that question. I'll err on the side of caution here. Yes? Okay.
Yes.
So the quote from Eric Harris, one of the Columbine shooters, after he acquired his guns, it said, "I am fucking armed. I feel more confident, stronger, more godlike." Elliot Rodger, the Isla Vista shooter in 2014, "After I picked up the handgun, I brought it back to my room and felt a new sense of power. I was now armed. Who's the alpha male now, bitches?" So this sense of power is it's also known to these folks when they pick up those weapons. I mean, it's not lost on them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add that the sense of powerlessness, impotency, smallness, invisibility in our culture is just rampant for many, many reasons. I think what we've all been talking about kind of converges on these points, these core struggles that many people have from the beginning of life because of the messages they receive of not being important, not mattering, as Jeff was saying earlier. And so the gun, as Becker talks about in terms of weaponry in general, becomes an immortality symbol. He calls them immortality projects, as many of you know. And we see those displayed in our military parades, for example. Certainly we see that in major parades such as Russia displays, or China as well, other countries, demonstrating just how grand this power is due to even the exhibition of our weaponry. So this is why I think also open carry laws are so dangerous and chilling to society as well, because those can easily become fetish objects for people and be extremely attractive just by having them visible to others. It pumps that individual up.
Well, building on that, we have another question, I think, which is a good follow-up. And some of you have alluded to this already, but the person's asking here, any thoughts on why men are the greater users of guns? does death anxiety play a role in who is drawn to extremism and the power that guns confer, which I think you've started talking about, Kirk, and actually everyone, but any more thoughts on that?
At least from a extremist point, reactionary politics are inherently anti-feminist. So the people that are being targeted by those politics are men in general. Putting it within a historical context in the United States, you also have just men have had the political power for so long. I would actually have to look this up, but I don't know that women were permitted to own weapons for significant portions of the United States history. So I think that sort of masculine ownership of weapons has kind of always been a part of the United States culture. Not that I think that's a good thing, but I think the historical context is there. And as I mentioned, the reactionary nature and anti-feminist nature of far-right politics, which typically tends to embrace weapons more and the use of weapons and oftentimes violence, just kind of appeals more to a male audience.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
I think Pete's very correct about that. But we also have to, if you look at lots of different areas of research, men are more concerned with power and dominance than women are, and some of that is probably tied to testosterone. That men tend to be higher in testosterone, and there is evidence that testosterone goes along with a sense of power and more of a desire to feel dominant. And of course, guns are a way to enhance that feeling. So I think that's part of it too. Because the data are so strong that the men commit much more gun violence than women in pretty much every domain, every type. So that's part of it as well. The other point I would make is just that, again, if you're wealthy, right, or if you're in the if you're in an in-group that's in power in a culture, then you have less need for guns. Your power can come from money and resources, right? If you're wealthy and you're insulted, you hire an attorney and you sue. If you're poor and you're insulted, you have more of a sense that you have to do something, right? And it comes down more toward physical power.
And we certainly know, as has been mentioned, that the justifiable lack of public trust and confidence among some, especially those who've been marginalized and haven't had access to the courts and to other forms of protection, may contribute in addition to the access to resources and the range of options that go with that. Although I do point out often in my presentations across California, especially, that in some of the counties that have a higher social economic status, we see firearm ownership at a very high rate as well. It's not limited to our urban centers or even to rural environments, but there's pretty consistent firearm ownership around the state, and maybe more privacy in terms of how those firearms are used, or play a role perhaps in domestic violence and other forms of violence as well, and certainly around suicide, a concern too. Kirk, any other thoughts about the question here that you'd like to add?
I think it was covered well, but just to add to that, I think there are several ways that we can defensively react against that sense of smallness and helplessness. One is to become violent and both physically and symbolically powerful. And I do think that is traditionally associated with men and masculinity. Another is that we continue floundering and we become overwhelmed by that sense of smallness and helplessness, and we can go into a depressed position. And that may be I don't want to stereotype here, but that may be more of a tendency of women, and maybe traditionally people who lack the means of overcompensating for the smallness and the helplessness. And I think that's an important issue, the question of whether people have the means to do everything they can to avoid that vulnerable, helpless position. And so that may be related to the the male-female difference as well. I think temperament is also an issue. And of course, people can have temperaments toward more aggression, either as male or females, but the means is very important.
Well, and it's important, I think, just listening to all of your comments and thoughts on this, that to note that we have a lot of firearms that are owned privately in this country, high rate of gun ownership, but being a gun owner doesn't necessarily connect directly to being violent. So my organization, Giffords, and many of the other national organizations, we have a gun owners coalition, for example. Gabby Giffords is herself a gun owner, was before she became a victim of gun violence, and continues to be a gun owner. And we work with gun owners all over the country who are very concerned about the level of violence and who are committed to some of the reasonable, common sense gun laws and policies that Pete, you alluded to, in terms of restricting access, prohibiting access during a crisis, or when people have demonstrated that they may be a danger to themselves or others. The particular lethal nature of firearms intersecting with those situations can create a much more dangerous reality. And so I think that's important to point out. I also just got word that, and wanted to give a shout out to the Terror Management Theory Lab at James Madison University. They are watching today in their lab. So welcome and thank you for joining us. We have another question from the audience here. Could panelists speak on factors amplifying anxiety, pandemic, political polarization, that are capitalized on to drive narratives that amplify fear to sell more products, guns, and media likes and ads? So the particulars of this moment in terms of both the pandemic, political polarization, and anything else that comes to mind. Curious about your thoughts on that. Anyone want to start us off?
I'll start, but I think Kirk's work is especially relevant here. Certainly the pandemic, the social, the social justice concerns, the invasion of Ukraine, and this is creating a crisis of meaning. It's like, what does it mean to be a meaningful human being in a chaotic world where death is everywhere, and people are contributing to the deaths, and so polarization, which I'll let Kurt speak to the polarization, but let me just make the point that early in the 20th century there were a number of authors, including Thomas Mann in The Magic Mountain, who pointed to a problem in meaning, that with the sort of the shift away from religious ideologies as a basis of meaning, there's been a crisis of meaning that's been going on since the turn of the 20th century. But it's been amplified without question in recent years. And the more we know about different meaning systems, and that there's so many meaning systems, the harder it is to sustain faith in whatever basis of meaning and value that one subscribes to. And so I think we're seeing that getting worse and worse. And of course, the homicide rate has been increasing in recent years. And the pandemic absolutely plays a role there. But I'll let Kirk speak to the polarization more if you'd like
to. I think you're right on, Jeff, with all of those points. I would add that racism is certainly a major issue, as well as isolation. And that is related to the pandemic as well. But I guess I'd like to emphasize a through line here also, that it seems to me that we are struggling more and more with what I would call emotionally impoverished relationships. I don't think that kids in many places in our country and world are being offered the kind of relationships that can build a sense of significance, of meaning. The relationships like the culture, I think too often tend toward the quick fix, instant result, or just negligent, partly because parents are so caught up in their work lives and making a buck, et cetera. And also people are caught up in technology. I think technology is a huge problem here. It can be great in many ways, so I don't want to paint it black or white, but on the negative side, that has a lot to do, it seems to me, with an increasing, certainly isolation, an inability for people to connect at a more person-to-person level where they can really go in depth as to what matters about their lives. Great conversations are very constricted by machine-mediated contacts. Just texting, or kind of, again, the quick exchanges. All kinds of images affect people, feeling like they're less than the image they see on their screen. So many ways that technology can be undignifying of the human spirit, the human quest for deeper meaning and for what really matters about living. So, yeah, I would add, technology has been more and more relied on since the pandemic too, for both good and ill. And so, yeah, it's partly a question of what kind of society we're going to forge.
Well, we have a few more questions I'd like to get to before we run out of time. One of them here is someone asked, I, TMT, Becker informed pacifist, find myself rooting for Zelensky Ukrainians for their violence. What does existential psychotherapy have to say that might be helpful about my internal conflicts here? I don't know, Kirk, if you want to start us off with that one.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing to have feelings about a leader, about even a destructive situation that's very uncomfortable, to have feelings of identification with somebody very powerful, who may also be destructive in their own way, and just being wantonly violent. I think it's an understandable identification when you identify with the helplessness of the victim. I mean, in this case, we're talking about, from everything I've gathered, an extreme case of victimization. Zelensky is a leader of an extremely victimized culture here. And to want somebody who's extremely victimized to find justice is a very understandable feeling. That's very different than identifying with somebody who is sadistic or wanting to lord themselves over another culture, seems to me. we're talking about different dynamics at play there. So
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Any other comments? I see Pete, you're nodding your head. Would you like to chime in here?
Yeah. I would just say that pacifism is all well and good, but I think self-defense and community defense is equally as important. And I don't think that's contradictory. Pacifism, when you're being invaded by a destructive force, if you don't respond to that, it only invites more death and potentially more destruction. So I don't think that there's a contradiction there. The question in the person who asked the question being a pacifist and finding some degree of identification or joy in the other person, I don't think that's a contradiction at all.
Well, thank you. We have, I think this might be a good question for each of you to comment on and sort of take us into the end of the session today. Not nearly enough time to cover all of these issues and to hear even more from our experts. But this person's asking, how might we effectively bring this material, for example, our real defensive reasons for attachment to guns and violence, into public awareness and political discourse? So sort of what can we all do to integrate what we're talking about today, as I'm understanding the question, and a deeper understanding of our real defensive reasons for attachment to guns and violence into public awareness and political discourse? What are your thoughts on that?
My thought about the problem we really haven't talked that much about is what's blocking us from making good progress and getting control over gun violence. And I think the answer ties into politics, and that people grab onto ideologies that become a central way they feel of value, and that blocks compromise, right? And that leads to extreme positions. The NRA obviously is incredibly frustrating that they don't want to compromise on anything. And, life only progresses well when there's compromise. So there's battles against reasonable gun laws that don't take guns away from responsible citizens that are blocked because people are so invested in their ideology as a basis of how they feel of value. And if people understood this better, they might be more willing to compromise and understand there's different perspectives that have some validity. You don't have to give up your own, but acknowledge that others have some validity as well. And that's a little pie in the sky, but I think that Becker taught me that. And I think that these ideas can teach other people that as well.
At the depth psychological level, I'm running for president of the American Psychological Association, and my main platform is to promote what I call emotionally restorative relationships at every level we can, and affordable, accessible, emotionally restorative relationships. And if anybody is good at that, it's psychologists and mental health professionals who can bring that en masse, I hope, to the country, make that much more available. And I'm talking about making it more available, let's say, to underserved communities in the form of in-depth, longer-term therapeutic relationships. I think we could also promote healing dialogues or bridge-building dialogues between people who are very divided in our country, such as Braver Angels has been doing. I think the whole notion of doing what we can to help people to become more present to uncomfortable or alien parts of themselves can help move us toward a less defensive and more life-affirming direction. There's a lot more to say there, but that's summary.
Thank you. Thank you. Pete, any thoughts on what more we can do?
Yeah, I think Jeff and Kirk have both had excellent points here. I really think that learning to engage across the political spectrum is really important. And as Kirk really hammered on, along with that engagement, to the best of your ability, maybe modeling kind of what that sort of deeper connection to the self can look like. And also from a political angle, I think getting people's needs met. People are less likely to become violent or extremists if they are getting their needs met, and that is both, you know, our physical needs as well as our spiritual and community needs. So finding ways to kind of engage with folks and bring community together, build community within your area, you know, it's one of the best things you can do to kind of begin to chip away at violent tendencies.
Thank you so much. And the only thing I would add to, I think you've all covered this extremely well, is in the advocacy realm in terms of including these conversations in the public discourse or trying to shape the political trajectory and efforts. I know at Giffords, and for those who want to check it out, giffords.org, where we have what some refer to as the Encyclopedia of Gun Laws, you can become even more informed about what the policies are, what the stats are, what the current issues are. I know there was a reference, for example, Pete, you made to red flag laws and having a better understanding of what those 19 states and the District of Columbia have adopted, which is essentially a civil remedy to temporarily remove firearms when someone may be a danger to themselves or others, building on long-standing domestic violence civil protective orders or restraining orders that do that and more, and having a better understanding not just of what the media covers, but of really what are the breadth, the depth of our policies, long-standing policies on regulating firearms when there are concerns about harm to others in the United States. So there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of good information, and I would encourage everyone to follow our experts here on social media or in their publications. And of course, the work of Ernest Becker's foundation is really terrific in this area. So thank you and kudos to you for organizing us today. And I'll turn it back over to you, Deborah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julia. You did a wonderful job moderating, and all our panelists. I have a million more questions myself, but I think they'll have to wait for another day. If you enjoyed this webinar, please sign up for our emails, make a donation. I'll ask Lila to put a link in the YouTube video for donations and signups. We operate on a really small budget and appreciate any support you give. Also, if you signed up for this webinar, then we will send you a copy of our communications guide for advocates, which gives some ideas for people working in these political and social justice fields, some ideas for how to lessen defenses that come from death anxiety to try to help be persuasive or just have productive civil conversations with people. So thank you again to everyone, and the recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, and much gratitude to you all for your interest and support. Thank you.